A recent federal case out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts has reignited a nationwide debate over election integrity, voter identification, and immigration-related fraud. The case centers on Lena Maria Orovio Hernandez, who has now been convicted on multiple charges tied to identity theft, financial fraud, and illegal voting in the 2024 U.S. election. According to federal prosecutors, Hernandez lived in the United States illegally for more than 2 decades while using a stolen identity. During that time, she allegedly built an entire life around fraudulent documentation, enabling her to access government benefits, establish residency, and ultimately cast a ballot in a federal election. Authorities estimate that she received more than $400,000 in improperly obtained public benefits. The U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, Leah Foley, described the case as deeply troubling, stating that it represents a slap in the face to immigrants who enter the country legally and follow U.S. laws. Foley emphasized that the level of entitlement displayed in the case was astonishing, particularly given the length of time the fraud went undetected. The case quickly became a focal point of discussion in American media, especially on Fox News, where it was framed as more than just an isolated criminal act. Commentators argued that it exposes broader vulnerabilities in the U.S. system, vulnerabilities that extend beyond immigration enforcement into financial oversight and election security. To discuss the implications, Fox News brought in Jonathan Turley, a constitutional law professor and legal analyst, who offered a broader interpretation of what the case represents. Turley argued that this was not simply about one individual committing fraud, but rather about the interconnected nature of illegal immigration, identity theft, financial abuse, and voting violations. According to Turley, the scale of the fraud is what makes the case especially alarming. He noted that this was not a minor offense or a paperwork error, but a scheme that resulted in nearly $500,000 in losses, combined with a violation of election law. In his view, cases like this provide insight into why the federal government estimates that billions of dollars may be lost nationally through similar forms of fraud. Turley explained that the process often follows a predictable pattern. An individual acquires one fraudulent or stolen document, then uses that document to obtain additional forms of identification. Over time, this creates a chain of legitimacy that is difficult for authorities to detect. Once embedded in the system, individuals can access benefits, employment, housing, and even voter registration. From this perspective, Turley argued, it becomes difficult to separate election integrity from broader questions about border enforcement and identity verification. He suggested that treating these issues as unrelated policy debates ignores how closely they intersect in practice. The discussion then turned to the SAVE Act, legislation supported by former President Donald Trump and many Republicans. The bill seeks to strengthen voter verification requirements by mandating legitimate proof of identity when registering or voting in federal elections. Supporters argue that the measure is a common-sense safeguard designed to protect public confidence in the electoral system. Critics of the SAVE Act, however, have raised concerns that stricter voter ID requirements could disenfranchise certain voters. During the Fox News segment, attention was drawn to comments made by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who has described voter ID laws as Jim Crow 2.0, invoking comparisons to historical laws that enforced racial discrimination in the United States. That comparison has proven highly controversial. In interviews, Schumer has maintained that voter ID requirements disproportionately affect minority voters, despite polling data suggesting otherwise. When confronted with survey results showing broad public support for voter ID, Schumer reiterated his position, arguing that the criticism is justified. Fox News highlighted data from a Pew Research Center poll indicating that voter ID laws enjoy overwhelming bipartisan support. According to the survey, 95% of Republicans, 71% of Democrats, favor requiring identity to vote. The data also challenges the racial framing of the debate. Surveys consistently show that a majority of Black voters support voter ID requirements, a point frequently cited by supporters of the SAVE Act as evidence that the Jim Crow 2.0 label does not reflect public opinion. Turley responded sharply to the rhetoric surrounding the issue. He described the comparison to Jim Crow laws as historically inaccurate and deeply insulting, particularly to those who lived under actual segregation and voter suppression. In his view, requiring identity to vote is not comparable to literacy tests, poll taxes, or other discriminatory barriers of the past. He further pointed out what he sees as a contradiction in modern political discourse. Americans are required to show identity to board airplanes, enter government buildings, open bank accounts, and attend certain political events. Yet asking for identity to vote has become politically explosive. According to Turley, this disconnect reflects a broader shift in political messaging, where emotional language is sometimes used to override empirical data. He argued that this strategy may resonate with activist circles, but appears increasingly out of step with the general public. As the segment progressed, the conversation returned to the Massachusetts case that sparked the debate. While supporters of stricter voter ID laws cited the conviction as evidence of systemic weakness, critics cautioned against using individual cases to justify sweeping policy changes. Still, Turley maintained that even a small number of verified cases can have an outsized impact on public trust. He argued that elections depend not only on fairness, but on the widespread belief that the system is fair, and that belief erodes when stories like this emerge. By the end of the discussion, the issue remained unresolved, but one point was clear. The debate over voter ID is no longer confined to abstract policy debates. It is increasingly shaped by real cases, hard data, and competing interpretations of what constitutes both access and security in a democratic system.
As the voter ID debate intensified, the discussion shifted from individual cases to broader political and public responses. Fox News and other media outlets highlighted contrasting positions within the political landscape, illustrating the deep polarization over what some consider a straightforward security measure and others frame as a civil rights concern. Following the Massachusetts conviction, supporters of stricter voter identification argue that the case exemplifies the vulnerabilities in the system. Jonathan Turley, the constitutional law expert, emphasized that even isolated instances of voter fraud can have systemic implications. According to him, such cases fuel public skepticism about election integrity and can erode confidence in democratic institutions, especially when combined with reports of widespread financial or identity fraud linked to illegal immigration. The conversation also touched on comments from key Democratic figures. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who has repeatedly labeled voter ID requirements as Jim Crow 2.0, faced criticism for framing the debate in terms of racial discrimination. Turley and Fox News commentators argue that such rhetoric overlooks polling data that indicates broad support for voter ID laws across racial and political lines. For example, surveys consistently show that 75% of Black voters favor presenting identification when voting, a statistic that challenges the notion that these requirements are inherently discriminatory. Additionally, the segment explored the positions of other Democratic leaders, including Vice President Kamala Harris. Past statements by Harris highlighted concerns about voter accessibility in rural areas, where residents may have limited access to government offices or photocopy services. Critics, however, contend that such obstacles are minor compared to the broader risks posed by unverified voting. Turley noted that the SAFE Act contains provisions to accommodate voters who have legally changed their names, such as after marriage or divorce, ensuring that identification requirements are not insurmountable. The discussion also incorporated real-world examples of oversight beyond Massachusetts. Fox News highlighted scrutiny into the finances of Congress members, such as Representative Ilhan Omar and her spouse, whose reported income rose significantly after taking office. The coverage linked these cases to broader public concerns about transparency and accountability, illustrating how financial oversight and voter integrity debates are often interconnected in public discourse. Throughout the segment, public opinion data was referenced repeatedly. Polls indicate that the majority of Americans, including large percentages of both Republican and Democratic voters, support identification requirements for voting. Turley emphasized that this majority consensus underscores the disconnect between political rhetoric and public sentiment, suggesting that partisan framing sometimes exaggerates opposition for political gain. Visual graphics in the broadcast illustrated these points. For example, charts depicted the breakdown of voter ID support by party affiliation and race, highlighting clear majorities across demographics. Voiceover commentary reinforced the data-driven perspective, asserting that these statistics demonstrate a broad acceptance of voter ID laws as reasonable safeguards rather than discriminatory barriers. The segment also addressed practical considerations. Turley pointed out that identification requirements are commonplace in other aspects of daily life. Americans are expected to show IDs to board planes, enter federal buildings, open bank accounts, and participate in various civil processes. By this logic, requiring identification to vote aligns with broader societal norms of verification and accountability. Despite these arguments, critics continue to challenge voter ID laws on ethical and accessibility grounds. The discussion acknowledged these concerns, particularly in rural areas or communities with historically marginalized populations. However, Fox News and Turley argued that technological solutions, state-level accommodations, and exceptions already exist within proposed legislation, mitigating the risk of disenfranchisement while preserving system integrity. As the debate unfolded, the segment highlighted the political strategy surrounding the issue. Republican leaders use voter ID advocacy as a platform to champion election security, while Democratic leaders often emphasize potential barriers to participation. Turley noted that while both sides employ strategic framing, the data suggests that public consensus favors the basic principle of identification verification. Finally, the segment concluded with an appeal to consider both facts and context. Turley emphasized that individual cases, such as the Massachusetts fraud conviction, are not merely anecdotes. They illuminate systemic vulnerabilities. By examining these cases, lawmakers, policymakers, and the public can better understand the intersection of election security, identity verification, and financial oversight.